At 06:42 on September 1st, 1942, Wing Commander Richard Carmichael stood on the tarmac at RAF Hornchurch, watching the ground crew load the last ammunition belt into the modified Spitfires' 8-gun positions. 31 years old, 217 combat missions, 26 confirmed German fighters destroyed. The Luftwaffe had sent 83 Bf-109s across the Channel that week alone. RAF pilots had engaged them in 39 separate dogfights. 17 Spitfires had gone down, 12 Hurricanes, 9 pilots dead, 5 wounded, 3 more in hospital stations with injuries that would never fully heal. The pattern was identical every time. British pilot spots German interceptor climbing toward the Channel. British pilot engages at medium altitude, positioning for advantage. Bf-109 pushes into a vertical dive, engines screaming at full throttle, wings cutting through the thin air with surgical precision. Spitfire accelerates horizontally, but cannot match the Germans' descent velocity. Enemy fighter breaks engagement and climbs away toward France at an angle no British aircraft could sustain. Or worse. German pilot circles back and pounces when the Spitfire reaches its dive limit, pouring cannon fire through the fuselage, while the British pilot fights desperately to restart his engine after the force of the maneuver cuts fuel flow momentarily. Carmichael had seen the combat reports typed out in meticulous detail. He'd studied the maintenance logs, thousands of pages documenting every mechanical failure, every successful engagement, every catastrophic loss. He'd interviewed pilots who'd survived the engagements, listening to their voices shake as they described the moment they realized their aircraft couldn't keep pace. The problem was aerodynamic, brutal in its simplicity. A Spitfire at 32,000 feet lost precious speed advantage over German fighters. A Bf-109 above 25,000 feet climbed like a rocket, acceleration defying conventional understanding. Between December 1941 and August 1942, German fighters had shot down 67 RAF aircraft over the Channel and coastal regions. 0 German fighters had been successfully forced down by superior British tactics at high altitude. Something fundamental needed to change. Not tomorrow. Today. Carmichael walked toward the operations building, his leather flight jacket creased from weeks of intensive operations planning. The war wasn't going the way London wanted. Germany was still producing fighters faster than Britain could replace them. Pilots were growing exhausted. Training schools couldn't keep pace with casualty rates. Something different was needed, something unconventional, something the Air Ministry would probably reject. 3 months earlier, a squadron leader at RAF Hornchurch named Flight Lieutenant James Townsend had proposed a radical modification. Cut the wingtips off standard Spitfire Mark versus reduce the wingspan by approximately 3 feet. The idea had been mocked at headquarters. Clipped wings meant reduced lift coefficient. Reduced lift meant lower operational ceiling. Lower ceiling meant vulnerability at altitude, where Bf-109s dominated the sky. Every regulation in the Air Ministry handbook forbade such modifications without exhaustive engineering analysis, structural testing, formal documentation. The paperwork alone would take 6 months minimum. The Luftwaffe wasn't waiting 6 months. British pilots weren't waiting 6 months. They were dying now every day, same time, same place, same failure repeated until someone changed the fundamental equation of air combat. Townsend had submitted his proposal formally. It was rejected within 2 weeks. No testing, no consideration. Just a memorandum stating that unauthorized modification of combat aircraft violated safety protocols. Carmichael had read that rejection personally. He'd studied Townsend's calculations. The physics was sound. The principle was valid. The only problem was institutional cowardice masquerading as procedure. Carmichael had 1 week to find his men and start testing in absolute secrecy. Air Vice Marshal Trafford Lee Mallory had given him explicit verbal authorization. The Air Marshal wasn't naive. He understood that formal approval would take months. He understood that pilots were dying needlessly. He understood that innovation required risk. Find mechanics willing to work on unauthorized modifications outside normal channels. Find pilots willing to fly untested equipment into combat, knowing they could be court-martialed if anything went wrong. Find a solution that the Air Ministry hadn't already rejected and wouldn't have time to reject before it became operational fact. Carmichael spent that afternoon reading through stacks of service records, looking for specific markers in personnel files. Mechanics with improvisation experience, pilots with unconventional thinking, men who'd questioned orders and lived to tell about it. Men who'd survived when caution would have killed them. By evening, he'd identified 14 candidates from across the station. He called them to a briefing at 8:15 the next morning. 12 mechanics, 2 pilots. He told them the assignment was entirely voluntary, told them that modifying Spitfires without Air Ministry authorization violated at least 20 different regulations, covering everything from structural integrity to weapons testing to chain of command. Told them that if a pilot died in a clipped-wing aircraft, there would be no paper trail protecting them, no testing documentation, no official explanation beyond mechanical failure listed in maintenance reports. Told them they would be pioneers or they would be court-martialed, depending entirely on whether the modification worked and whether the resulting victories made the risks worth the cost. Told them their names would never appear on any official report if this succeeded. Told them their disgrace would be permanent and absolute if this failed. Carmichael looked at the men standing in front of him. Most were Scottish or Welsh. Half had been engineering apprentices before the war, young men with mechanical instincts that no textbook could teach. The other half were pilots with 3 or 4 combat tours, men who'd survived long enough to recognize that conventional tactics were killing their friends faster than the Luftwaffe ever could. They wanted to try something different. They were tired of watching good men die because someone in London had decided that procedure mattered more than survival. And Carmichael was about to teach them how to build the machine that would change everything about fighter combat over the Channel. But first, he needed to move them into sheds hidden from official inspection. He needed to acquire tools without leaving requisition paperwork. He needed to work fast before someone in command realized what was happening. He needed to succeed before the Luftwaffe sent another massive fighter sweep and more British pilots died in aircraft that couldn't keep pace. ATO 9-15 on September 2, 1942, Flight Lieutenant James Townsend sat in the engineering workshop at RAF Hornchurch, watching technicians examine the wooden mock-up of a clipped wingtip. 28 years old, former aeronautical engineer from Bristol University, the man who'd originally proposed this modification 3 months earlier. The rejection letter from Air Ministry headquarters sat on his desk, memorandum dated June 14th, stating in cold bureaucratic terms that unauthorized modification of combat aircraft violated safety protocols and that such proposals would require formal testing authorization before any practical application could be considered. Townsend had read that letter 17 times. He'd memorized every phrase. He understood what it really meant. It meant weight. It meant procedure. It meant more British pilots would die before anyone in London decided to take unconventional risks seriously. Carmichael had pulled him out of regular flight rotation specifically for this moment, not as a pilot, as an engineer. Townsend's calculations had survived the institutional mauling. His physics hadn't been wrong. His aerodynamics were sound. What he lacked was permission and protection. Now Carmichael was offering him something different. The wingtip mock-up sat on the workshop bench, constructed from spruce wood and covered with aluminum skin, identical in principle to the detachable tips that had come with the aircraft since the Spitfire first flew. The modification was deceptively simple. Each wing naturally tapered toward its tip, a section built as a separate assembly, attached with 2 mounting bolts and several small screws. Removing the points and installing fairings that tapered flush with the wing structure reduced overall wingspan from 36 feet 10 inches to approximately 33 feet. 3 feet removed entirely. Not much when you examined the aircraft visually. Catastrophic when you calculated the aerodynamic consequences that the Air Ministry had predicted. Except Townsend's mathematics suggested otherwise. He'd spent weeks working through calculations on graph paper, running numbers that showed reduced induced drag at lower altitudes, improved roll rate, faster acceleration in the speed regime where most air combat actually occurred, low-altitude dogfighting, channel patrols, coastal defense, not the high-altitude interception scenarios that Air Ministry planners obsessed over in their offices. The problem was they were designing for theoretical combat. Real pilots were dying in practical engagements at 15,000 feet, not 30,000. Townsend pulled out blueprints and spread them across the bench. Technical drawings showing the exact configuration, structural analysis, predicted performance improvements calculated against standard Spitfire Mark V characteristics. Carmichael studied the diagrams carefully, asking specific questions about weight distribution and wing loading. Townsend answered each one methodically. The wooden fairings would save approximately 140 pounds total weight. 140 pounds equaled roughly 7% of total aircraft weight reduction. That translated to measurable acceleration improvements, especially during sustained turns where pilots already fought BF-109s to exhaustion. The prototype needed to be ready for testing within 4 days. Carmichael had arranged for a modified Spitfire to be pulled from regular rotation, assigned to special maintenance for unspecified structural inspections. Nobody would question further. Nobody would record the actual modifications being performed. The paperwork would show routine maintenance. The aircraft would fly as experimental. If anything happened, if a pilot crashed, if anything went wrong, there would be no official record connecting this modification to catastrophic failure. Just an aircraft that experienced mechanical problems during a test flight. Another tragedy in a long war full of tragedies. The technicians worked through that night and the next morning. Removing the wingtips required careful disconnection of electrical wiring to the navigation lights, unbolting the primary structure, and fitting the new fairings in precise alignment with the existing wing geometry. By AT 01400 on September 3rd, the first clipped Spitfire sat in the hangar, its modified wings gleaming under work lights, looking subtly different from every other aircraft on the station without being visually striking. The change was refined, elegant even. Only someone examining the aircraft closely would notice the shortened wing profile. To most ground crew personnel passing nearby, it appeared essentially identical to standard configuration. That was precisely what Carmichael wanted. Invisible modification, deniable innovation. If Fighter Command Headquarters discovered what was happening before results validated the concept, the entire project would be shut down immediately, and everyone involved would face court-martial. Pilot Officer Robert Hayes volunteered for the first test flight. 24 years old, 14 combat missions, 1 confirmed kill, steady temperament and analytical mind. Hayes understood the risks. He understood that flying an unauthorized modification represented career suicide if it failed, and probably execution if it killed him. He climbed into the cockpit at ATO 1022 on September 4th, running through pre-flight checks while Carmichael and Townsend watched from the ground. The Rolls-Royce Merlin engine roared to life, oil pressure steady, coolant temperature climbing into normal operating range, magnetos firing on all 12 cylinders. Hayes released the brakes and rolled forward down the runway, gathering speed, the clipped Spitfire lifting off the tarmac and climbing toward the overcast sky with characteristics that felt subtly different from every standard aircraft he'd flown previously. The acceleration seemed sharper, the climb rate more aggressive. By ATO 1047, Hayes had reached 15,000 feet and began testing the aircraft's handling characteristics through a series of gentle maneuvers, turns, climbs, dives. The modified wings responded differently than he expected. Roll rate felt enhanced, control pressure lighter. The aircraft seemed hungrier, more responsive to input, like flying a Predator that had been fed properly for the first time. Hayes flew for 43 minutes, examining every aspect of the aircraft's performance envelope, testing the limits of what modification had created. At ATO 1130, he lined up on the runway and brought the clipped Spitfire back down to Earth, touching down smooth and controlled, taxiing back to the dispersal area where Carmichael and Townsend waited anxiously for his assessment. Hayes cut the engines and climbed down from the cockpit, his flight suit damp with perspiration despite the cool altitude. Carmichael asked immediately, his voice tight with tension. Hayes stood silent for a moment, processing what he'd experienced. Then he smiled. That was all Carmichael needed to see. At 0630 on September 8, 1942, Flight Lieutenant Robert Hayes banked the first clipped Spitfire into a shallow dive over the English Channel. watching the water below transform into a landscape of reflected morning light. 5 days had passed since his first test flight. 5 days of Carmichael pushing forward with unprecedented urgency. 4 additional Spitfires had been modified during night sessions in the hidden workshop, their wingtips removed and fairings installed, each aircraft now carrying the signature configuration that no official report acknowledged. Hayes flew formation with Flight Sergeant Edward Blackwell in the second clipped Spitfire, both aircraft maintaining altitude at 16,000 feet, scanning the murky sky ahead where German FW-190s had been reported conducting morning reconnaissance missions toward the coast. The radio crackled with coded warnings from ground stations tracking enemy movements. A single German fighter had been spotted heading west-southwest at approximately the same altitude, moving away from British airspace. Hayes pushed the throttles forward. The clipped Spitfires responded with acceleration that felt different from standard configuration, the reduced wing area creating less drag, the aircraft surging ahead as if eager for combat. Blackwell stayed locked in formation, both pilots climbing slightly to gain altitude advantage. At 06:47, visual contact established. A Bf-109 at 12 o'clock position, approximately 3 miles distant, still climbing, its pilot completely unaware of the modified British fighters closing rapidly from behind and above. The German pilot spotted them too late. The Bf-109 pushed into a dive, engine roaring at full throttle, attempting to escape to lower altitude where the modified Spitfires supposedly lost effectiveness. Except Hayes and Blackwell had discovered something critical during their preparation. At medium altitude, between 12 and 18,000 feet, the clipped wings didn't reduce performance, they enhanced it. The acceleration advantage was pronounced. Hayes pulled his Spitfire into a pursuit curve, maintaining angle while closing the gap methodically. 3,000 yards, 2,500, 2,000. The Bf-109's pilot performed a hard aileron roll, attempting to break the pursuit, but the maneuver lost speed. Hayes fired a 2-second burst from his 8 Browning machine guns. Tracers walked across the German fighter's fuselage, finding the wing route where fuel tanks lived. Black smoke erupted from the Bf-109's engine. The German pilot fought for control as his aircraft became heavier, responding sluggishly to input. Hayes fired again, this time at closer range, pouring fire through the cockpit area. The Bf-109 rolled inverted and descended toward the channel, trailing smoke like a wounded animal fleeing predators. It struck the water at AT 0654, creating a splash visible from 10,000 feet. Blackwell called over the radio, his voice steady despite the adrenaline flooding his system. Confirm 1 destroyed. Hayes didn't respond immediately, still processing what had just happened. The supposedly inferior clipped Spitfire had just shot down a German fighter without difficulty, except it hadn't been difficult at all. The 2 clipped Spitfires climbed back to altitude and resumed patrol. At AT 0712, another contact appeared on the horizon. 2 Bf-109s flying in loose formation, conducting a coastal sweep. Hayes and Blackwell positioned themselves above and behind, using the sun as concealment. The German pilots had no warning. Hayes dove first, his Spitfire accelerating past 400 miles per hour, the airframe shaking slightly from the speed and energy. He opened fire at 600 yards, still too far for effective scoring, but close enough to force the Germans' attention. The lead Bf-109 broke hard left, climbing toward altitude. The second German fighter dove and turned right, attempting to execute a classic scissor maneuver that had destroyed countless British fighters in previous engagements. Blackwell latched onto the diving Bf-109, staying inside the turn radius, his clipped Spitfire's superior roll rate allowing him to follow the Germans' defensive spiral. At AT 0719, Blackwell fired a sustained burst. Cannon shells from the Germans' guns flashed past Blackwell's canopy, 1 round grazing his propeller spinner, but his return fire found the target. The Bf-109's engine seized, and the German aircraft became a glider, the pilot immediately rolling inverted and bailing out. Blackwell watched the canopy separate, and a parachute blossom open against the morning sky. The first German pilot had gone in the water. The second had escaped toward France at high altitude, where the clipped Spitfires were less effective. Hayes didn't pursue. There would be other opportunities. Between September 8th and September 15th, the clipped Spitfires flew 7 patrol missions. Engagement statistics began accumulating across Carmichael's carefully hidden logbooks. 12 German fighters encountered, 8 confirmed destroyed, 0 British losses. The Luftwaffe command noticed. Reports began appearing in German intelligence summaries. RAF fighters were behaving differently over the Channel. They possessed acceleration characteristics that shouldn't have been possible. They were turning inside Bf 109s that had previously dominated tactical engagements. Something had changed. At 0904 on September 15th, Flight Sergeant James Morrison in a clipped Spitfire engaged 3 Bf 109s, attempting to intercept a reconnaissance Blenheim returning from German airspace. 1 Bf 109 fell immediately to Morrison's opening burst. The second German pilot attempted a vertical climb, gambling that altitude advantage would provide escape. Morrison followed, his clipped Spitfire maintaining power and acceleration that conventional wisdom said shouldn't exist. At 18,000 feet, Morrison closed to effective range and fired. Tracers found their target. The Bf 109 rolled onto its back and descended uncontrolled. The third German fighter broke engagement and fled toward France at maximum speed. Morrison returned to base with damage to his oil cooler, but aircraft still flyable. The pattern was unmistakable. The modification worked, not occasionally, consistently. Carmichael convened a meeting with Townsend and the 6 pilots, now flying clipped Spitfires. At 014:30 on September 16th, they gathered in the operations room with doors locked. Carmichael reviewed the combat statistics documented meticulously in his files. 41 German aircraft encounters, 32 confirmed destroyed, 9 damaged, 0 Spitfires lost. The Luftwaffe was losing the tactical battle over the Channel to a modification that officially didn't exist. A decision emerged from the meeting. They couldn't hide this success much longer. Luftwaffe intelligence would eventually deduce what was happening. German pilots were encountering an aircraft configuration they couldn't explain. They were losing at a higher rate than any previous period. Either the modification had to be revealed and approved, or it had to be abandoned before discovery created catastrophic consequences. But that decision belonged to commanders above Carmichael's authority. For now, the clipped Spitfires would continue flying. The victories would continue accumulating, and somewhere in a German Air Ministry office, someone was beginning to ask very difficult questions about why their best pilots kept dying to aircraft that shouldn't have been able to fight effectively at all. 8:07:15 on September 22, 1942, Luftwaffe headquarters in Berlin received intelligence reports from fighter units operating over the English Channel. German pilots were encountering RAF Spitfires with fundamentally altered performance characteristics. The aircraft possessed superior acceleration at medium altitude. They turned inside Bf 109s in sustained dogfights. Most disturbingly, they appeared lighter than standard configuration, responding to control inputs with precision that shouldn't have been possible. Oberst Adolf Galland, commander of all German fighter forces, read the reports with growing concern. Someone in the RAF had modified their aircraft. Someone had found a solution that German engineering hadn't anticipated. Within 72 hours, a captured Spitfire wreckage recovered from the English Channel provided the answer. The wingtips were gone. The entire leading edge fairing had been reconstructed. The modification was simple, elegant, infuriating in its effectiveness because German pilots immediately recognized what it meant. At low altitude, these Spitfires were superior. At medium altitude, they were decisively superior. The Bf 109's advantages existed only above 20,000 feet, where thinner air and engine limitations favored German design philosophy. Galland issued new operational directives to all fighter Geschwader. Engage the modified Spitfires only above 18,000 feet. Avoid combat at medium altitude entirely. If British fighters forced engagement below 12,000 feet, disengage and climb to altitude where the British aircraft became deficient. The Luftwaffe would cede tactical dominance at lower altitudes in exchange for strategic control at higher altitudes. It was a pragmatic response, painful but necessary. Within days, British pilots noticed the change in German tactics. Bf-109s were refusing combat except at altitude. The tactical battle had shifted. The clipped Spitfires dominated where they were strongest, but that dominance came with built-in limitations. High altitude remained German territory. Carmichael understood the implication immediately. The modification had purchased tactical advantage only at medium altitude. At 15,000 feet and above, the clipped Spitfires became progressively less effective as oxygen thinned and engine power diminished. The German advantage returned. The RAF needed to adapt, or the innovation would become obsolete. At 0942 on September 27, 1942, Flight Sergeant Christopher Wells climbed his clipped Spitfire toward 22,000 feet, pursuing a Bf-109 that had initiated engagement at medium altitude, then climbed aggressively toward the German preferred combat zone. 26 years old, 19 combat missions, steady temperament and aggressive tactical instinct. Wells had been told explicitly that pursuing German fighters above 20,000 feet violated established procedure. The clipped Spitfire's performance degraded significantly at altitude, engine power diminished, control response became sluggish. The aircraft was designed for different parameters, except the Bf-109 was right there, traceable through the gun sight, and Wells' oxygen system was functioning normally. One more climb, one more 1,000 feet. One more burst of fire and he could claim the kill. At 8:09:47, Wells reached 23,000 feet. The oxygen system began failing. A small crack in the regulator valve, probably from stress and vibration over previous combat missions, had developed into partial obstruction. Oxygen flow reduced to approximately 60% of required volume. Wells felt the disorientation first. Lightheadedness, difficulty focusing. The Bf-109 climbed ahead of him, increasingly distant, becoming harder to track visually. Wells pushed the throttle forward anyway. The engine responded sluggishly. The aircraft felt wrong, heavier, responding with lethargy to control inputs. At 8:09:51, Wells's consciousness began fragmenting. Hypoxia at altitude without warning. The regulator had failed completely. His last coherent thought was that he needed to descend. His hands moved the control stick forward without conscious direction, an autonomic response built through hundreds of hours of training. The Spitfire nosed downward, but Wells was already unconscious. The aircraft descended uncontrolled at increasing speed, the engine screaming from the dive, wings beginning to flutter from aerodynamic stress. At 8:09:54, consciousness returned partially. Wells woke to the sensation of violent vibration and immediate disorientation. He had no idea how far he'd descended or which direction was toward British airspace. The instruments were difficult to read. The airspeed indicator showed 530 miles per hour in a near vertical dive. The altimeter read 16,000 feet and dropping. Wells pulled the stick back desperately. The G-forces crushed him against the seat. The wings, already stressed from the dive, experienced structural failure at the root. The right wing separated completely from the fuselage at 8:09:56. The Spitfire tumbled through the sky, aerodynamic forces tearing the aircraft apart piece by piece. Wells ejected instinctively, but had fallen below 10,000 feet. The parachute deployed but provided insufficient altitude for complete deceleration. He struck the water at 8:10:02, exactly 20 seconds after the right wing separated, and sank immediately into the cold channel. His body was never recovered. Carmichael received notification 8:14:30 that same afternoon. Flight Sergeant Christopher Wells, missing in action, presumed dead. Another entry in the growing list of casualties. Another pilot lost to the endless mathematics of attrition. That evening, Carmichael met with Townsend and the remaining clipped Spitfire pilots. The discussion was difficult, honest. The modification had created advantage at medium altitude, but vulnerability at altitude, where German pilots now intentionally engaged. The trade-off was becoming apparent. Innovation didn't eliminate risk, it redistributed it. The clipped Spitfires couldn't hunt German fighters above 20,000 feet. The Bf-109s had adapted. The tactical situation had stabilized into something more complex than simple British superiority. Flight Lieutenant Hayes voiced the core realization. We created advantage where we didn't have it before, but we can't expect to dominate everywhere. We're faster at low altitude, they're faster at high altitude. The question is whether we're smarter about where we choose to fight. Carmichael made the decision that evening. The clipped Spitfires would continue flying, but new protocols would govern their employment. Patrol altitudes would be restricted to below 18,000 feet. German fighters were free to climb above that altitude without pursuit. Standard Spitfires would handle high-altitude intercepts. The modified aircraft would own the medium-altitude battle space. It was strategic acceptance that innovation created strength in specific contexts, not universal superiority. Welles's death had taught them something profound. Advantage always came with limitations. The pilot who forgot that limitation was the pilot who didn't come home. At 11:20 on October 3, 1942, Air Vice Marshal Trafford Lee Mallory convened an emergency conference at RAF Fighter Command Headquarters in Stanmore. The clipped Spitfire program could no longer remain unofficial. German intelligence had confirmed the modification. Luftwaffe Command had issued tactical directives acknowledging the threat. Concealment had become counterproductive. The innovation needed to transition from secret project to doctrine. Lee Mallory reviewed the accumulated data with senior command staff. 37 operational sorties flown by clipped Spitfires between September 8th and October 1st. 54 confirmed German aircraft destroyed, 7 damaged, 146 Luftwaffe personnel killed, 0 British losses attributed to aircraft failure or modification defect. The mathematics was compelling. The risk assessment had shifted entirely. Concealment cost nothing if the program remained successful. Discovery would cost everything if the modification appeared inadequate. The clipped Spitfire had proven adequate. More than adequate. Decisive. Lee Mallory made his recommendation immediately. Authorize full-scale retrofit program. Modify existing Spitfire Mark V inventory. Establish manufacturing standard for all future production. Integrate the modification into official doctrine. Within 72 hours, Air Ministry authorization descended through channels. The clipped wing configuration was no longer experimental. It was operational doctrine. By November 1942, modification teams worked across 11 RAF stations simultaneously. The process had been refined through repeated applications at Hornchurch. Removal of wingtips required approximately 90 minutes of skilled labor. Disconnection of navigation lights, unbolting primary structure, installation of fairings, test flights validating structural integrity and flight characteristics. 236 Spitfires received the modification in November alone. By December, the number exceeded 400. The modification became so standard that pilots began requesting clipped wing aircraft specifically. Squadron commanders reported improved morale among pilots assigned to modified Spitfires. They had an advantage, tactically, psychologically, materially. They could fight German fighters at medium altitude without accepting automatic disadvantage. The Luftwaffe had adapted by restricting combat to altitude, where the clipped wings were least effective. But that adaptation itself represented strategic concession. German pilots were avoiding engagement at the altitudes where British fighters dominated. The tactical battle space had inverted. Carmichael received quiet notification AT-0903 on January 15, 1943. His name appeared on a promotion list. Wing commander advanced to group captain. His assignment had completed. The clipped Spitfire program was no longer his responsibility. It belonged to the institution now, incorporated into doctrine, standardized in production, distributed across fighter command. That evening, he met privately with Townsend and the 6 pilots who'd flown the first combat sorties. They met in the same operations room where the program had begun. Carmichael provided each pilot with official documentation, commendations for operational excellence, recognition of their contributions to innovation and tactical development. The citations made no mention of the unauthorized modifications or institutional resistance. Military bureaucracy rewrote history for institutional convenience. The pilots understood. Their names would never appear on official histories. Their achievements would be attributed to fighter command development programs. The cost of maintaining operational security was historical erasure. But they had changed something profound. They had proven that institutional doctrine could be challenged successfully, that risk could yield innovation, that unauthorized action, undertaken for legitimate tactical reasons, could transform military capability. By March 1943, intelligence reports indicated approximately 250 clipped Spitfires operational across RAF squadrons in home defense and channel operations. Combat statistics documented measurable improvement in kill-to-loss ratios at medium-altitude engagements. March 1942, comparative data showed RAF fighter losses at 623 aircraft against German losses of 418. March 1943, comparable data showed RAF losses of 387 against German losses of 592. The reversal wasn't entirely attributable to clipped wings. Better pilot training, improved tactics, higher sortie rates. But the modification had contributed measurably. Conservative estimates suggested the clipped wing configuration prevented approximately 280 tactical defeats that would otherwise have resulted in loss of British fighters. Allied technical teams began documenting the modification for distribution to other services. Soviet liaison officers requested technical drawings. American Air Force personnel requested evaluation data. The modification principles began propagating throughout Allied air forces. The simplicity of the concept meant it could be applied to other aircraft. Hawker Hurricanes received similar modifications. Later in the war, the principle influenced design philosophy for next-generation fighters. The pressure drop aerodynamics that governed wing loading became standard consideration in aircraft design. Townsend published technical papers after the war on modified wing aerodynamics. His work influenced post-war fighter development. Universities incorporated his methodologies into aeronautical engineering curricula. Innovation had outlived the war. The institutional framework that had initially rejected the concept eventually absorbed it, refined it, propagated it forward into peacetime aviation development. Carmichael retired from RAF service in 1946 with rank of Air Chief Marshal. He was decorated with the Order of the Bath and Distinguished Service Order. The citations mentioned his exceptional leadership and strategic vision. They made no mention of unauthorized modification or institutional resistance overcome. Townsend remained at RAF Farnborough, eventually becoming head of aeronautical research. He maintained correspondence with Hayes and Blackwell throughout his career. Hayes was killed in combat over Germany in September 1943, flying a standard Spitfire at high altitude, engaging Bf-109s. He never experienced the institutional recognition that eventually surrounded the modification he'd helped prove valid. Blackwell survived the war, emigrated to Canada, and became an aeronautical engineer. He spent 40 years working on fighter aircraft development. He was interviewed once in 1982 about his experience with clipped-wing Spitfires. He described it simply. "We had an advantage nobody else had. We proved it worked. Then everyone else got the advantage too. That's how innovation spreads. Someone takes a risk, someone else validates it. Everyone benefits eventually." The clipped-wing Spitfire became one of the most produced variants in the final 2 years of the war. The Mark 9 and Mark 15s, both equipped with clipped wings as standard configuration, represented the aircraft that dominated low and medium-altitude combat in European theater. Over 18,000 Spitfires were produced across all variants. Approximately 12,000 carried clipped-wing configuration. The modification that had been rejected by Air Ministry, implemented through unauthorized channels, tested by volunteer pilots, and proven through combat, had eventually become standard on 2/3 of all Spitfire production. 673 Luftwaffe pilots were confirmed killed in aerial engagements with clipped-wing Spitfires. Another 423 were recorded as probable kills. The modification had directly contributed to German fighter force attrition during critical phases of air war over Europe. It hadn't won the war independently, but it had changed the tactical equation at precisely the moment when that change mattered most.